"It's gone into Nelly's wall, that has," Mother would say when I'd searched for some lost toy that had inexplicably vanished. And I'd never question it, just accept that some mysterious being with no toys of its own existed somehow behind the clumsy plaster of my bedroom wall. I'd think of her, Nelly, creeping out from the dark of night to steal carelessly discarded playthings for her own. The idea of Nelly never frightened me, except, that is, on nights I'd lay my trap. I'd purposefully leave something, never a favourite thing, in the middle of the bedroom floor and watch from under covers for movement in the darkest corner from where I imagined Nelly to emerge. If ever I did see or hear anything, it was surely the amalgamation of a child's overstimulated fancy and a mouse scratching somewhere behind the skirting board of that old house. Nevertheless, my duvet-clutching palms would sweat. I never did catch Nelly, of course, and the planted toys were never taken. Nelly was a clever one. Thinking back through an adult's perception, I recognised Nelly to have been my mother's invention, a cunning lie to distract me from the fact she'd thrown away a toy that was broken or outgrown, and, during the inexorable transition from child to man, like the toys she did take, Nelly faded from memory too. Now, the one childhood trauma I do recall was my father's desertion. I was his perfect lad, so that abandonment pained and puzzled me deeply, leaving just Mother and myself, who I always felt cold towards me. Nevertheless, I loved that house. I felt it harboured a benign personality that would follow me throughout the place, except to the front parlour. That room always seemed ill at ease, and I would avoid treading upon the threadbare rug covering those croaking planks. Despite these things, I made a happy childhood of it. Then, when I came of age, I left that creaking house and travelled for a time before settling to make a family of my own, which I vowed to shower with far more affection than I'd ever received from my dear mother. I would visit her, of course, whenever in town, and years later in the nursing home where she'd struggled to recognise me, for her wits had long since faded. It was on the day she died there that the memory of my childhood phantom surfaced once more. In the moments before death, my mother didn't call out for me, but for Nelly. We took on that big old house, my family and I, but it was an inheritance with quite the to-do list. Walking jaded rooms and corridors, I'd encounter youthful memories of each turn, knowing we'd indelibly paint over them with our own. We comfortably settled, growing used to how the structure spoke through creaks and groans. Even our daughter grew to ignore the scratching behind the skirting boards of her room, my old bedroom. We'd redecorate eventually, and so for now it was as I remembered, frozen in time, large and high-ceilinged, with deeply patterned and peeling wallpaper that revealed lumpish plaster. And at night, boundlessly dark. It was one morning when my wife asked if I knew where Veronica's toy pony was, that Nelly returned to memory once more. It was a favourite toy of our daughter's, but she'd snapped her leg off the thing. My wife assumed I'd taken it to the workshop out by the stables, but admitting I'd yet to find time to fix it, we searched the house thoroughly. "It's gone into Nelly's wall, that has," I said, when the search proved fruitless, and explained my mother's harmless untruth. In this case, however, neither of us had thrown the toy away, and so its disappearance remained mysterious. Preparations for Veronica's gymkhana were a convenient distraction from the vanished toy. She was an excellent equestrian, and it was expected another bright rosette might add a much-needed splash of colour to her otherwise monochrome bedroom. But it wasn't to be. Somehow her horse fell, trapping Veronica's leg. There followed a long evening at hospital, having the limb set in plaster. It was a complicated fracture, and doctors' orders were an initial week or two of total bed rest, and so there she was resigned to linger, bedridden, bored, and broken. We fussed over her, of course, and Veronica exploited that sympathy to the full. Breakfast was brought up, lunch, then dinner, and finally supper. A television was commandeered, and each night I'd read to her. The house made its nighttime noises, of course, and creatures scratched around inside the walls, but sleep would eventually come. We were just one night into that routine when a scream launched me into consciousness. I was up and at the bedroom door instantly. Veronica had dreamed of something tugging at her plastered leg. I fetched water, a painkiller, suspecting the nagging pain had disturbed her slumber, and through the filter of semi-consciousness her mind had made an exaggerated matter of it. I made a pantomime of checking the room to reassure her that all was secure, tucked her in, and left her to dream again. This became the new routine, and more than once a night. It was on the fourth such time of happening that I found Veronica in a hysterical state. "A huge spider," she sobbed. This night she had awoke to see that a giant black spider had crawled up onto her plastered foot and was trying to drag her from the bed. I inquired in a comical tone, just to highlight what a ridiculous notion it was, how big such a creature needed to be to achieve its goal of stealing her away. Her response was to hold up her hand, fingers tensed and splayed. "Like this," she cried. I felt Veronica's forehead to find no sign of fever, and presuming it an unfortunate side effect of strong medication, I resigned to remain there the night for reassurance. The bare boards were hard and my makeshift mattress thin, but sleep did briefly visit. At some point, I'm not sure when, I became aware that the noise of invisible scratching was incredibly loud. My eyes blinked open, and I felt the gravity of fear press down hard upon me. A shadow unfolded from the corner, clicking and creaking into shape. Long-limbed and spindly it emerged, claw-like tips scraping on wood as the huge spider jerked and crawled across the floor towards Veronica's bed. Dread held me paralysed, as if the thing's venom affected me even from this prone viewpoint. I watched, helpless. It, pulling itself into a shaft of moonlight that had stumbled in through the curtains, and I observed it wasn't a spider at all, but the withered hand of a cadaverous arm, and more. An emaciated thing, twisted and awkward, crept onwards, arms stretching, fingers twitching as their tips probed for Veronica's cemented leg. Only when that skeletal hand took hold to violently drag my daughter from her bed did adrenaline become my antidote, and I pounced, yelling loud enough to wake the nearest village. Veronica screamed too, a second village shaken from sleep. The creature, hideous of aspect, immediately released, retreating into shadow. I made a grab. The shriveled visage contorted to expel a silent scream, deafening me to all else. The fragile nature of its skin, dried out like parchment, startled me into letting go. I braced to lunge again when lights flickered on with my wife's startled entrance, vanishing the spectre, along with the darkness. In the immediate aftermath I gathered myself, and then the emotional wreckage that was Veronica. I did my best to convince both it had been nothing more than a nightmare spilling into consciousness through the effect of medication. But this was my own harmless untruth, for in a secret and clenched fist I held a time-worn shred of fabric pulled from the wraith's shroud. The following morning I forcefully suggested a change of scenery might benefit Veronica's recovery, just until the present level of medication could be reduced, for it was no compliment to our current surroundings. A good and willing friend lived not too far away, and so with wife and daughter safely evacuated, I would replay my childhood mission, to lay a trap for Nelly. Hours trickled by that first night, an eternity to contemplate this wretched self-isolation. There I sat, a dark room in a dark house, moving only to press an ear to the wall following any imagined noise. The darkness played its tricks too, or maybe it was Nelly's mischief. Eventually my eyes grew tired of their constant scanning, and I surrendered to sleep. Next morning I telephoned to check on Veronica. She'd had an easier night, and to report that I still was waiting upon the exterminator to attend to our rodent problem. That lie told, I slept all I could throughout the day, and rose to the sight of shadows stretching long across surrounding acres as I drew curtains in preparation for my night's eerie vigil. I bedded in, alone with my thoughts, wondering if, like my mother, I were losing my mind, in planning to capture some bad dream. I would wake intermittently with a start, straining not to succumb again, but then found myself cursing dawn's warm return. I wandered the memory-haunted rooms a while. Something about being alone drew out forgotten moments stored up somehow in the very fabric of this place. It was in the front parlour, where even now I avoided the rug-covered floorboards, and the shadow of heavy candlesticks traced out time, that echoes of heated arguments and violent exchanges surfaced from the abyss of recollection. It seemed to me now that whatever relationship my parents pretended for my infantile benefit was a lie. They were estranged by some awful secret. And, upon the precipice of sleep, I pondered if the house might surrender it to me. By the third night, I felt I was becoming a nocturnal thing, like Nelly. She was a clever one, my imagined phantom, but even though fatigued, I vowed I'd not let her break me. And all at once, with the arrival of that thought, the fault in my plan was revealed to me. I stood, stumbled forward, and reached blindly into the darkness, spilling over a jumble of possessions cloaked by twilight's veil. My hand closed upon an object, some toy or other, it mattered not which. I removed it to the centre of the room, placed it upon the floor, and stamped down hard. The sound, not unlike the cracking of joints, seemed to fill the empty house. Only when that uncanny resonance faded did I retreat beneath my eider-down cave. I watched and waited, questing eyes finding no fault in the darkness. I watched and waited, mind tumbling in the screaming silence that rattled through every part of the house. I watched and waited, and heard a scrape, shuffling. I breathed so lightly I thought I may suffocate, and there, a shadow with form and density came creeping out, creeping forwards, slow and awkward of gait, bent on claiming the prize. The knotted and crimped figure assaulted my vision, and when it eventually reached out for my lure, the impulse of the moment seized me. I pounced, throwing the eider-down over the hideous creature. The cover heaved and pulsed wildly, and fearing I would lose her again, along with any remaining shred of sanity, I leapt atop it. All was still, the gnarly pile dormant beneath me. Unsure if I'd woken from a nightmare, I pulled myself upright to tentatively lift a corner. Nothing stirred, so I mustered courage to fully reveal the crooked frame. In a blur of movement she was on me, clinging like a monkey, bone-ended fingers pinching my flesh. A staggered retreat pressed me against a corner, its dry and craggy countenance nuzzling against my own. The impossible moment tasked the brittle remnants of my wits until I realised this was no attack, but an embrace. I felt a deep and peculiar sadness for the loose bag of bones cradled in my arms, and a strange sensation came upon me. I can only describe it as an osmosis of emotion which projected a tragic biography against the backdrop of a dream which suddenly overtook me. I sensed torment, a childless couple crushed by miscarried hopes. I observed these echoes, neither able to calm a bitter husband or prevent a forsaken wife's infidelity. I witnessed the spawn of that sinful liaison too, a desperate and bloody labour spilling forth a woeful frame unto the world, and it was thought a blessing should it not survive. But it was a stubborn one. To avoid shame for him and scandal for her, the mangled child was kept hidden, but a mother's love transcended a father's disgust. These contrary extremes carved out an emotional chasm between the two until one night, in a drunken rage, he forced himself upon her. I wondered how such a violent coupling could prove so blessed. A perfect lad was born, who the father doted upon and provided anything for, unlike the unfortunate sibling whose only offerings were the broken or discarded playthings a mother could smuggle in. It was an embezzlement that enraged him. But the wife found her strength through deep-seated resentment until only she remained standing, there in the parlour, bloodied candlestick in hand. Not long after, the poor girl child became ill and succumbed to the malady. Then, denied even an honest burial, the shameful secret was sealed away inside its clandestine tomb. I woke to the sound of birdsong and light streaming in through the leaded window. The house felt oddly at ease. I threw the eiderdown aside and pulled myself up, flexing out the knots of my frame. The bait I'd set was gone, so I glanced to the shelf for validation and felt curiously relieved to see the other playthings I'd toppled the night before. I caressed Nelly's wall, once so deeply malevolent, but now washed in dawn's warm touch. I knew what I must do, and fetched a sledgehammer from the stable workshop. It was short work, breaking through to the cavity behind the wall where I found her lying among the clutter of ages. A myriad of broken toys. Some I recalled as my own, and one as Veronica's pony. Glistening tracks carved by tears streaked my dust-powdered complexion. I lifted the dried husk from its tomb. She was no weight at all, pitiful and twisted, dressed in fragile and faded cloth. I kissed my sister on the forehead and knew that my mother would be pleased. I had quite the tale to recount upon my wife's return, and, with the correct authorities informed, we ensured Nelly's remains received the reverence long denied, to be scattered at the same location as my mother's. And of course, it was the excuse needed to finally redecorate my old bedroom. The next thing on my to-do list, however, wasn't so attractive a prospect. To silence the floorboards of the front parlour and tackle the subject of what may lay beneath them.